Warning: contains somewhat mature content, including language, brief violence, and mild sexual themes, and may not be suitable for people under age 14.
Baron clapped his huge hands together.
Excellent!
He boomed, making Cho flinch. Baron opened up a portal identical to Reitan's, and he led Cho through. Reitan came over and went through as well, then Baron stepped through last and sealed it. Once on the other side, Cho saw that they were in some kind of huge gymnasium made of white marble. There were even stands surrounding the place so that people, or demons, could watch. "Where are we, Baron?" Cho asked. Baron smiled.
This is an old arena where demons used to fight for their honor,
He replied.
Of course, marble is considered lower class now, so they built a new arena out of silver. No one uses this one anymore, so I use it for training.
Baron jumped up into the stands, and Reitan followed. Cho looked around to them. "Where are you going?" she asked.
This is your training time,
said Baron.
We will observe you as you fight your opponent.
"Who's my opponent?" Cho asked, feeling a little uneasy. Baron laughed and set his hand on Reitan's head. Reitan glowed a dark blue for a moment, and then a second Reitan popped up right next to him. Cho did a double take as the second Reitan hopped down into the arena.
When you kill this duplicate of Reitan,
said Baron,
it will not harm the real Reitan. This will be your practice opponent.
Cho stared at the duplicate, and he stared back, a very cold stare. Cho looked over to see the real Reitan watching her with the exact same look. Cho growled and looked back at the duplicate and rushed towards him. The duplicate Reitan was ready for her. He conjured up a ball of fire in each hand and threw them at Cho, sending her flying backward and crashing into the hard marble floor. Cho didn't know how to control her power, or even which power she had. She closed her eyes and concentrated, then opened them to see blue lightning rushing from her towards her opponent. The bolts hit him squarely in the chest, causing him to fall backward. Cho took this opportunity and stood up, running towards the momentarily stunned Reitan. She stood over him and conjured up more lightning, this time in the form of little balls in her hands. She screamed angrily, forcing all of her anger into the electricity in her palms, and threw them repeatedly at Reitan's chest. Meanwhile, at the stands, Baron was laughing, while the real Reitan watched with wide eyes.
Either she's really serious about this training,
said Baron, amused,
or she's really angry with you.
He laughed again as he watched Cho turn her lightning into a solid crystal blue spear. She took it and began stabbing the duplicate in the chest multiple times. Finally, the duplicate Reitan disintegrated, and Cho slumped to the floor, sobbing. Baron stopped laughing and looked to Reitan.
Damn! What did you do to her?
Reitan watched Cho sadly, not answering. A few weeks went by, each day Baron coming to train either Cho, Reitan, or Reitan's soldiers, and each day Reitan not speaking to Cho very much. Cho was eating very little and barely got any sleep at night. She was miserable. The only human she had contact with in the underworld was giving her the cold shoulder, and she didn't know why. One night, Reitan was sleeping in his chair again, and Cho couldn't fall asleep as usual. She stood by the window, staring at the moon, then around at the ground below. She studied the bridge-like ground, then the space below it, observing the strange black hole that swirled menacingly, threatening to swallow up the whole underworld. Cho turned her attention to the bridge again, following one path until it stopped at what looked like a huge wall of water. The water glowed and rippled with nothing supporting it. Cho wondered what it was there for. Cho sighed, looking over to Reitan, seeing he was still asleep. Her hand moved over something on the windowsill, and she looked down to see there was a latch. She had never noticed it before. She unlatched it and opened the window, feeling a light, cool breeze come in from the outside. I can escape, Cho thought wildly. I can escape this place, and Reitan will never know. If he wants to be cold towards me, then maybe I'll just leave and never see him again. Cho gave a silent laugh as she swung her leg over the sill, and then the other leg. She sat there for a moment, looking at the long drop below. She was sure she'd be able to survive the fall now that she had demonic powers. Cho! There came an angry shout from the other side of the room. Cho flinched and looked behind her to see that Reitan had woken up and was hurrying towards her. Cho glared at him and jumped off the sill, heading towards the ground quickly. To her surprise, Cho landed on her feet. She nearly lost her balance but kept herself standing as she tried to shake off the surprise. She looked up to the window just in time to see Reitan jumping from it. Cho panicked and ran for it. She didn't know where to go, but decided to head to the wall of water at the end of one of the branching bridges. She found she could run a lot faster than before, but it was no match for Reitan's speed. Cho looked behind her to see Reitan closing in on her. Cho tried to run faster, but she tripped, skidding on the hard white ground. She skidded over the edge of the bridge but caught herself with her hands and was hanging on for dear life. She looked down and saw the dark red hole swirling right below her. Reitan came running up to her just as one of Cho's hands slipped off the stone edge. She screamed for help as the other hand slowly began to lose its grip. Reitan extended his hand to grab hers, but it was too late. Cho lost her grip and fell straight down into the black hole. "No!" Reitan shouted, and he dove off the bridge, going after her. Cho landed hard onto damp ground. She gave a small dry sob as she sat up painfully and looked around. This place was much unlike the beautiful white paradise of the underworld she had been in before. Here, the sky was blood red with spiraling black clouds, and the ground was black, but had a damp, moldy feel to it. Cho stood up, observing her surroundings. It looked like a cemetery. There were stone statues of demons in crude poses, and here and there was a plain broken gravestone, its name illegible. Reitan landed on his feet right behind Cho, who turned around and gasped as he tried to grab her. She ran to hide behind one of the stone statues, shaking with fear of what he might do to her now she tried to escape. Reitan inched closer to her. "Cho, hurry! Get away from that!" he said, fear in his voice. He had his hand out to her, as if expecting her to run to him. Cho shook her head. "You haven't been talking to me!" Cho screamed. "You haven't been nice to me! You haven't been doing any of the things you used to do! I'm tired of it! Cho was cut off by a sudden movement of the stone demon she was standing next to. She looked up at its face to see that it had come alive. She screamed and tried to run, but it grabbed her and threw her to the ground. The other statues came to life as well and closed in on Cho, beginning to claw at her and attack her. Reitan ran up to the mob of stone demons and kicked them off of Cho, flames emitting from his feet and scorching the hard gray surface of the living statues. Cho was sobbing, covered in blood, her clothes ripped. Reitan carefully picked her up and ran as far as he could away from the statues. Cho looked to see where he was running and saw a wall of water identical to the one she saw at the end of one of the bridges. They passed through it easily, and when they came out of it, they were back on the white bridge. Cho saw Reitan's mansion in the distance and knew that they were safe. She cried hard, all of the pain in her body burning white-hot through her scrapes and bruises. Reitan sighed and opened a portal to return straight to his room with her. Once there, he set Cho on the bed and began stripping off her ripped clothing. "What are you?" said Cho weakly, getting frightened. "Shh," said Reitan sadly. "It's okay. I'm going to heal your wounds." Cho winced as her clothes were removed. Reitan tossed the shredded fabric onto the floor, then turned to each of Cho's wounds and conjured up a little yellow bubble over them. Cho could feel the pain slowly subside as these bubbles healed her. Reitan sat down next to her, putting his face in his hands. "Cho, I'm sorry," he said softly. Cho watched him, blinking slowly. It was wrong of me to treat you that way. I don't know what came over me." "Reitan," said Cho, lip trembling. "Just, please don't ever do it again." Reitan turned and gave her a gentle hug, trying hard not to hurt her. Cho began to sob softly, and Reitan began to stroke through her hair. Once all of Cho's wounds were healed, Reitan waved his hands over the bubbles, and they disappeared. He got up and brought Cho a fuzzy robe for her to cover herself with. She sat up and put it on, then watched Reitan as he guiltily stared at the floor. "Why were you so cold with me?" Cho asked. Reitan looked up at her and sighed, sitting back on the bed and putting an arm around her. "That time when you gave me permission to caress you," he began. You did something strange." Cho tilted her head curiously. "What did I do?" she asked. "You kind of transformed," Reitan replied. "It was strange. Your hair turned white and your skin dark, and the candles blew out. You told me I was using you and I didn't care about you, and you tried choking me." Cho gasped, covering her mouth. "When I relit the candles, you turned back to normal, but you fainted." "But how could that have happened?" Cho asked. "I'm not sure. Cho, has something happened to you that would cause you to build up a lot of anger? Something from your past?" Cho went silent and looked down at her knees. Then she looked to the cross necklace she was still wearing. "Yes," said Cho finally. "Something did happen." She reached her hand over to her rag doll that was lying by her pillow, and she cuddled it. I was molested by my father. Reitan's eyes widened, and then he furrowed his brow. Molested? How much? He asked, trying to keep the anger out of his voice. A lot, Cho replied sadly, staring at her doll. It began when I was 8. Of course, I didn't understand what was going on. All I knew was that it was scary and painful. My mother didn't find out until I was 10. She couldn't do anything to stop him. She went up to him and yelled at him for hours, and finally he threatened to kill both me and her if she didn't stay out of his way. He also said he'd kill us if we tried to call the police. When I was 15, my mother ended up spending a lot of time with me to try and take my mind off it all. She gave me this necklace and made me this doll, and told me that everything will be all right as long as I have these 2 things with me always. And she was right. After she gave me those things, most of my nightmares stopped, and Father was promoted, so he was working much too often to get any time with me. Then one day, my father was sick of it. I was 17 when he quit his job. He came home and dragged me by the hair to his room, but my mother was sick of it as well. She tried to defend me and even managed to call the police. Father stopped her, though, and stabbed a knife right through her back. Father smiled at me and said, "It's just you and me now, sweetie." He locked up my doll and necklace in a box and continued with the torture. My mother's dead body lay by the phone for a whole year. Finally, I was 18 and determined to leave. Of course, I was afraid he wouldn't let me leave. So one day, when he was out with some friends, I broke open the box to get my doll and necklace, then packed up my important things and left for the train station. When I boarded the train, I asked someone if I could use their cell phone, and I called the police on my father. I have no idea what has happened to him since, but that is why I came to Tokyo. Raiden stared at her, obvious horror and sadness etched into his handsome features. "And that's also why you were scared of me touching you," he said. Cho nodded. "But Kane told me he knew what had happened in my past, and he said I should allow you to at least caress me," said Cho. Raiden blinked. "Kane?" he said slowly, then sighed and put his head in his hands. "I'm such a fool." "Raiden?" Cho said, worried. "I lost my best friend because I was jealous that you liked him more than me," he replied. "And then I nearly lost you because I was afraid you'd transform again. I'm such a fool!" Cho frowned and gave him a light hug. Raiden closed his eyes and sat there silently, and Cho knew he was trying not to cry. "You could always go apologize to Kane," Cho suggested. "I'm sure he knows you're going to do it sooner or later." Raiden nodded. "That's a good idea," he said. "We'll go later in the day." He looked over to the window to see that the sky was gray again, turning white. Chances are he's still sleeping. Raiden looked down to his knees, and Cho could almost picture the thoughts rolling through his mind haphazardly, getting tangled on the way out of his head. "Raiden," Cho began, "I'm not angry with you. Just please, don't ignore me like that ever again." Raiden looked at her sadly. "I'm so sorry." He took her into his arms and hugged her tightly. Cho's eyes widened in surprise, but then she relaxed and closed them, smiling gently. Raiden sat there holding Cho tightly for a few hours, long after the sky had turned completely white. Finally, Cho gently pulled away from him. "Perhaps you should go apologize to Kane now," she suggested. Raiden nodded. "All right," he replied. "Get dressed then." Cho smiled weakly and went over to get dressed. Raiden stood as well and found a shirt to put on. When Cho came back out of the bathroom dressed in a clean set of clothes, Raiden put his arm around her and opened a portal to Kane's home. They went into the gloomy stone house and up the stairs, opening Kane's bedroom door. Kane was lying upon the stone table just like last time. At first, Cho thought he was sleeping, but then he spoke.
"I've been expecting you, Raiden,"
he said hoarsely. Raiden bowed his head, ashamed. "Kane," he said, "listen, I'm really Kane interrupted him.
"And without hesitation,"
he said, getting up slowly.
"I forgive you."
Raiden blinked as Kane slowly staggered over to him and Cho. He set a bony hand on Raiden's shoulder and looked him straight in the eye.
"Jealousy is a powerful emotion," worse than any demonic emotion in existence. To blame you for a simple human mistake would be foolish. I would know human mistakes very well, for I also experienced them.
Cho blinked, looking up at Kane.